Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Risk with Dr. Naveen Agarwal. Each week, we talk about a topic related to risk management of medical devices in a very casual and informal way. This is not a webinar or lecture. Rather, our goal is to talk about key topics and challenges in a very informal way and share best practices. I'm your host, Naveen Agarwal, and I'm the principal and founder at Achieve, where my personal mission is to help you achieve success in risk management. In this episode, I'm joined by Steve Silverman to talk about consideration of regulatory risks in a mergers and acquisition situation. Steve is the best person to talk about this because he has experience in the industry, in consulting, as well as at the US FDA. So he has seen a very broad view, and currently he advises clients to manage regulatory risks in a mergers and acquisition environment. We also talk about how this type of understanding offers a unique opportunity, a unique career development opportunity to quality regulatory folks. This was part of our conversation as a LinkedIn live event in front of a live audience. You're about to hear a recording of our conversation. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Today, I'm so excited to welcome Steve Silverman for a conversation about regulatory risk in the mergers and acquisition environment. What should we do to understand regulatory risk so that the firms we are supporting or we are working for can get support from investors? This is such a fascinating topic, and Steve is really a great person to talk to about this because he has seen the consulting world, he has seen the industry world, and he has been at the FDA. So he has a lot of knowledge about medical devices in general, regulatory risk, and I'm sure you will have really a good time listening to this key message from him today. So with that, guys, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to just settle down, get comfortable. You know how it goes. It's very casual. I'm going to have a conversation with Steve for the first 15 minutes, and then in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to invite you to participate because that's the whole point. The whole point is to engage with you, learn from your perspective, and you have insights and comments to share. So don't hold back when I invite you to participate. With that, Steve, I'm so excited to welcome you. Please go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience today.
Thanks very much, Naveen. It's really a pleasure to be with you again. I think that for purposes of your audience members, rather than boring them with a detailed list of the various things that I've done professionally, it's not that great a list to begin with. Let me talk about highlights. So right now, I am the president of the Silverman Group. And this is a consultancy that serves medical product companies on regulation, strategy, and policy issues. I think of note for you and for your audience members is the fact that my professional experience includes about 2 decades in federal service, where I spent a great deal of time at the Food and Drug Administration. I was privileged enough to work in multiple parts of the agency, and the last position that I held for 5+ years was director of the Office of Compliance in the Center for Devices and Regulatory Health.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you saw a lot of innovation. You saw a lot of compliance. I think you build a good perspectives, and now you are working with companies in the mergers and acquisition environment. Say a little bit more about what you're doing today.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, I mean, you're right. I was really lucky when I was at FDA because I think that in the device center in particular, I was present during a time when, as a function of the center's senior leadership, there really was a pivot, by which I mean there was a step back and a careful consideration across the center of whether or not the various components were doing the right thing. So in the pre-market product review space, for example, were the typical methodologies that were applied to evaluate and allow products to market, were they effective? In the compliance space, was this whole model of going out and inspecting firms and issuing some of them warning letters or other citations effective? And oftentimes the answer was no, there's a better way to do things. And so it was a fascinating time to be at FDA.
That's really awesome. And this could be relevant from a mergers and acquisition point of view, right? When you're thinking about regulatory risk and compliance risk.
I absolutely think so. And I apologize because you did ask me about regulatory risk and I got off on a lark about other stuff. But look, right now I am running a consultancy, and I was lucky enough after leaving FDA to work both through positions at AdvaMed, the trade association, and McKinsey, the consulting company, to work with device companies, right? And with investors. And to see that investors have a great deal of understanding of risk associated with companies that they are evaluating for investment and sometimes acquisition. But regulatory risk is an area that is extremely murky. And by regulatory risk, I mean the kinds of events that can occur in the regulatory context that affect device firms directly. So pre-market, right? Regulatory risk can encompass things like issues that arise while a device is being evaluated that raise questions or concerns on the part of regulators, and they're going to have an impact on the review pathway. How long it's going to take and what's going to cost to get the product across the finish line. In the post-market context, does a device maker really understand what it means that a firm that is, for example, marketing products has been inspected and that there were some findings from the inspection, and the firm now needs to do things to remediate the findings. And, Naveen, what I would say, forgive me for talking a bit longer and then I'll pipe down and let you respond, is that for your audience, right? I want to flip the lens a little bit, which is to say, okay, you don't have an audience of medtech investors. You have an audience of people who are inside of medtech firms. And a really appropriate question is, why does this matter to me? And my hypothesis is that it does for a couple of reasons. First of all, as you and as your audience member knows, there's just tremendous movement in the medtech space of personnel. And so the company that you're working for today might be different than the company that you're working for in a year that is subject to an investment or acquisition activity. So knowing this stuff is important. In addition, again, as your audience members know, you've got to deal with a lot of people inside of your company, some of whom are business professionals who are very good at their jobs, but who don't have regulatory expertise. And being able to explain to them regulatory risk and what the implications are in terms of cost, timelines, reputation, etc. That is super valuable. So it's an opportunity for your audience members to distinguish themselves by recognizing, by showing, like, hey, I get this. I understand what the significance of these events are, and I can talk about it in a way that non-experts understand and can respond.
So you can learn how to talk in the language of business.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not suggesting, I'm not suggesting to you or to your audience members that these regulatory professionals should go get their MBAs and start talking a different way. But I mean, it's like any language, right? You know, whether it's a foreign language or whether you're speaking to a scientist or what have you, you've got to be able to speak their language.
And especially, Steve, if we aspire to take on a leadership role, let's say we want to be a vice president of regulatory affairs at one time, we got to be able to tell our CEOs, hey, if we don't take this regulatory strategy, we're going to lose like 2 years of new revenue.
I mean, I couldn't agree with that more emphatically. And just to layer on to what I think is a totally true point, and I'll say, look, I have had the chance to talk to VPs and SVPs for regulatory inside a lot of device companies, and there is not a one of them that can't talk the way that you're describing. So I would say table stakes, right? If you want to advance, if you want to distinguish yourself as somebody who can perform on a widespread level with multiple stakeholders, you have to show that you can be both a regulatory expert and somebody who can distill and communicate critical business messages.
Yeah. And I think this is where conversations like these can be helpful, where we have this now idea in our mind that we should be kind of aware of this kind of skill set we have to develop. So Steve, on that front, can you share an example of, let's say, a M&A situation where regulatory risk was important, but maybe not paid as much attention, and that led to some problems?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And so, look, what I will say to you, Naveen, and to your audience members is that I've got a website. I'll give the information to access my website, and I mentioned only because on my website there is a particular article that I published recently, and in putting that article together, I did a little background research, and what I'll say is, there are multiple examples, and one in particular, of device firms that weren't able to accurately identify and estimate regulatory risk, and as a result, they got hurt. So there's one firm in particular, for example, that was looking for investment revenue, and in the midst of trying to seek investments, right, the firm was going through some regulatory events. I think it was a combination of evaluation from FDA, and there may have been some evaluation from foreign regulators as well. And what happened, as I understand, is that all of these regulatory events were ongoing, and the firm wasn't able to demonstrate that it really knew with specificity and accuracy what was the significance of these kinds of regulatory engagements and what it meant in terms of remediation costs, product review, operational changes that were required. And the upshot is that this firm totally failed to bring in investment from outside parties, and they approached something like 50 investors, all of whom passed. Right, and then that's not an unusual story. I mean, as you know, as your audience members know, medtech investment is way down. I mean, the whole medtech industry has been constricting, and that's definitely had an impact on medtech investment. Investors are much more careful and much more demanding in making decisions about where they are going to spend their money. And one component that I think is absolutely necessary to give those investors confidence is the ability to identify and clearly articulate and manage regulatory risk. And the point that I make in the article that I reference is that it's not the investor's job to figure out what that risk is. There's all kinds of risk that they are better positioned to evaluate and to quantify, but regulatory risk, understanding regulatory events and the implications, that's what we do. That's bread and butter, right? And so if we can't do that work, articulate and associate remediation steps and possible costs for senior managers, for outside investors, then certainly in the investment context, I think firms will lose. And I think for people who are inside of firms, they're not going to succeed in taking on more senior positions because they don't have sensitivity to key business decisions.
Yeah. So this is awesome. I think, guys, this is a perfect time to start inviting comments and perspectives or questions from you. I know, Roger, you are already waiting to speak, so I'm going to bring you in. And while we wait for Roger, and guys, other folks, please don't hesitate and don't wait. Don't wait for your turn. Raise your hand. I'm going to bring you on stage. And that way we can have a very rich conversation. And one more thing. If you raise your hand and I bring you in, I will make sure we wait for you to share your perspective, even if we run a little bit over time. Okay, I know I'm very particular about time, but I respect everybody who wants to raise their hand. That's the whole point. So, Roger, with that, please unmute your mic and share what you have in mind. Roger, if you can hear me, please unmute your mic and share your question or comment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So I just wanted to say, Steve, something else about your comment is, I think for a lot of engineers, especially as they working in med tech and get a little bit more senior, they get the chance to go to a startup or maybe even get approached to become a founder of a startup. And to your point, if you're a hardcore engineer and haven't thought about subjects like regulatory risks, the fact that you might go to a company, which might be a wonderful technical opportunity, be really fun to work on, but it could be highly personally risky to the person if you aren't familiar with the other side of the business and cannot assess the potential regulatory risk of the company succeeding. So beyond all the other things you've said, we engineers can have a selfish reason for needing to understand this a little better.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so Roger, I think that you make a great point. I've seen really, really fascinating, great companies with fascinating, interesting, useful products not make it across the finish line because the regulatory journey wasn't what they thought it was going to be. It was a lot tougher, a lot longer, and they couldn't sustain investment. Engineers in the med device space, I think, are brilliant. Truly, I mean, the value add is off the charts. So I'm not saying to engineers and who are kind of quote unquote hardcore med tech folks, go do something different. I'm saying you are super stronger by adding to your portfolio of skills the ability to step back and think about business considerations.
Yeah, absolutely
agree.
All right. Fascinating. Thank you, Roger, for that. David, you're on. Please unmute your mic and share what you have in mind.
Thanks, Naveen. This is really interesting, Stephen. I'm a former economist, actually, for the Federal Trade Commission. So I worked on antitrust cases, but not in
So I apologize to interrupt, but like the early part of my career was at FTC. I love that place.
Wow, fascinating. So I have a two-part question. First is, can you give us a flavor for what are some of the strategic motivations for M&A activity in the medical device industry? Is it market share? Is it new technology? What's driving this change? And then the second one is kind of more in the weeds. These marriages, once they're integrated, I assume are very, very complicated and very, very technical. Do you get involved in that part of it? Certainly in the precursor to an M&A, they must have an idea of what it's going to take to make this successful. I would love your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, so look, David, what I would say is this. Let me give a couple of thoughts, and then if I'm not getting to what you're saying, by all means, just tell me, and I'll try to redirect.
Thank you.
Look, I've had the chance to talk to some senior leaders at large and somewhat smaller med tech companies about this, about like what did they look for in terms of acquisition? Because if you're talking about a global device firm, and I won't name names. If you're talking about a global device firm that has multiple products, as you know, a big part of their growth strategy is acquisition. And what there is in the medtech space, this fantastic segment of startup companies that bring really, really great products to market. And their exit strategy is acquisition. They don't want to be an independent manufacturer. They want to demonstrate that their product is great. They sell to a large company and they move on to their next project. So
acquisition in and of itself is the strategy. Is what you're saying.
Yes, totally. Both, and that's bi-directional, right? Top down, big companies, and bottom up from small companies. And so, what makes it work? And for a while, I was just kind of dumb about this. I thought, okay, well, great. All that it needs to make it work is good company, good idea. They get FDA approval or clearance, and they're off to the races. And the folks that I talked to uniformly said, no, that's absolutely not. That's absolutely not enough. What really makes a difference are firms that are able to manufacture, market, and sell their products consistently as a condition before acquisition. So, small company with amazing product is not enough just to get FDA's green light to go to market. You actually have to go to market. You have to demonstrate that you know how to manufacture either yourself or with an outside contract manufacturer, market, sell the product. Companies that can, and satisfy regulatory requirements like post-market oversight. Companies that can do that successfully, they are the ones that investors pick, not just companies that have a really good product. And then in terms of my role, David, it's no, I do not get involved deep in the weeds. Like, okay, what's the what is the transition plan by which this company will be folded into the larger business? Although there are certainly consultancies that do that. That's not something that I have a great deal of experience with, and I don't think that it would be something that I would characterize as
no worries.
as a strong point for me. But I do think two things. I think it's important. I do think that there are mechanisms in place to help with that process. And B, I know that what you're describing represents a challenge, right, for large medtech companies and acquired companies, right? The transition process is tricky, right? Because you're bringing a small company into a larger company. You've got culture issues. There has to be crystal clarity in terms of whether there are any kind of post-market oversight issues, et cetera, et cetera. So anyhow, enough
this is awesome.
Monologue. Does that respond to your question?
Yeah.
So
thank you very much.
So David, just to let you know, in fact, this has been a question of interest to me for a long time. And I'm actually working on a case study right now, which I will share in a few weeks. Fascinating case studies. 2 big companies acquire 2 highly innovative cardiovascular products in 2016. One of them is a winner, one of them is a loser. I'm going to talk about that. Hopefully, it'll create some interest and some more conversation about that. So stay tuned. There's a lot going on in this space. I know M&A activity for MedTech is always one of the very, very hot things. So Rick, with that, I want to welcome you. You are with us on stage here. Please unmute your mic and share what you have in mind.
Thank you, Stephen. This is a great conversation.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Obviously, there's a lot than all this stuff, right? I was wondering if, from your perspective, when the regulations changes, for example, we went from MDD to EU MDR, that is a big regulatory risk for a lot of organizations. How does that impact your side of the house in what you guys do? Or does it?
I think it does. I mean, look, there are what I would characterize as macro regulatory changes that are real and micro. So like micro, a particular regulatory requirement gets modified in a way that has significance for some device makers. That can be a disruptive event. That can be anxiety producing. And Rick, what you're talking about and what I think is really interesting is there are also these macro events. And so FDA is definitely transitioning away from the quality system regulation. And is going to align. I'm not sure what the right description is. Integrate, merge, what have you. It's going to align its regulatory approach with EU and other outside the United States regulatory requirements, ISO 13485. And that is disruptive to varying degrees to all companies. I think it's going to be disruptive in a couple of respects. First, even large companies that are used to satisfying 13485 and already do so, they're going to have to think about how they are communicating in a way that kind of meets FDA's newer expectations after this transition. And there may be some smaller companies that are not doing a lot of work outside of the United States that aren't as familiar with 13485, much more familiar with the quality system regulation. And, you know, they're not going to need to suddenly adopt new regulatory practices because there's so much consistency between US and OUS regulatory requirements. But again, it's a new way of talking. Plus, I think the change inside of FDA is going to be massive. You know, on the one hand, FDA says, oh, no big deal. We'll take the time. We'll train our folks. Everybody's going to be speaking for the same script. That's fine. I think that's true. But I also think, like, good Lord. I mean, when you have got, like, there is, like, on the one hand, you've got, like, the head of CDRH who's able to talk no problem. On the other hand, you have an investigator located in Missouri who's used to working with the quality system regulation and has for the last 20 years, and all of a sudden shows up to a device facility and is talking a different talk and evaluating it somewhat differently. Well, that's going to be a tough conversation. So, Rick, I hope that my response answers your question. And if not, just tell me to redirect.
Go ahead, Rick. Do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's part of the, was from my perspective, when, for example, the European regulations went from MDD to MDR, that's a huge regulatory risk, in particular for small, mid-sized companies, from a clinical perspective, because their clinical stuff is not up to snuff. Or the regulatory is not, or they went from a risk class 1 to a risk class 2B. That's huge. And it caused a lot of stress.
Look, Rick, I mean, here's kind of the bottom line from my perspective about that. Yes, you are right. Yes, it is a risk. It's very important. It's for companies. Companies need to be aware of it and to deal with it where necessary. Candidly, I'm not the guy. You probably are. Like, if a company says, like, oh my God, this is, you know, something that we have to be prepared for and it's going to affect our business and we need to be ready to revise and represent our dossiers outside of the United States and we need help. Yeah, it's a big deal. When I talk about regulatory risk, my definition doesn't encompass that, but it's not to say that it's not a thing. It's a huge thing. It's just outside the scope of where I'm focused and really candidly what I'm able to speak to competently.
Yeah, but what I'm hearing here, Steve and Rick, is that as QA/RA professionals, I think there's an opportunity for all of us. If we recognize how, you know, based on how things are evolving and how things are moving, if we recognize potential regulatory risks in our environment, I think we have an opportunity to present a solution, an approach to our senior management, and that brings an opportunity for career advancement, guys. Think about that. So it's just not enough to say, hey, things are changing and it's going to be such a high risk. But if you can propose some new ideas and take initiative, I think you can advance your career. That's the key message I want all of us to kind of learn from. So, hey guys, we do have now a little bit more time. Maybe one question. If anybody wants to share, raise your hand. But if not, I'm gonna let Rick, David, or Roger raise their hand if they have anything else to share. Otherwise, I'm gonna try to wrap it up. So I'm calling out for just one more question if you guys have.
I'll throw something in there.
Sure, go ahead, David.
To bridge the gap between the technical and regulatory. So I know of a consultant right now who's working on a merger that's like kind of towards the end. They're trying to get things integrated and they're struggling with FDA approval. And in this particular case, I know that between the two companies, they have more than 30 different quality management systems.
Yeah.
And so they're struggling with that. And so it's kind of a blurred line between what is a regulatory issue and what is a technical issue. But at the end of the day, the FDA is not giving them approval. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's an absolutely critical concern, right? I mean, and what's interesting, right, is it directly, I think, implicates another super interesting question that I pay attention to, which is, what does a company need to have? Does it have to have a single quality management system? Can all of the companies, quote unquote, business units that operate semi-independently have their own quality management systems? What does FDA want? And there's no absolute answer, right? I mean, FDA will tell you, look, bottom line, we don't care. Just meet the quality system regulation. And if you do it through multiple systems or a single system, that's up to you. We can have another conversation at another time about what I've seen that works, doesn't work. But what you are describing, David, is not unusual.
Yeah.
It raises really tough issues, and companies need to account for it. And the issues, how do you integrate, I think, present themselves regardless of the type of business event that occurs in industry, whether it's a merger of two large companies, a large company picking up a small company, what have you. Those kinds of issues come up constantly.
Good. So guys, we are running against the clock now, but I'm going to keep my word and invite John, who raised his hand just in time, to share what he has in mind. Please be brief, John. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think for regulatory sakes, for what Rick was saying about the implications of risk, for the standpoint of a notified body, is ultimately the proactivity and the reactivity of your system. So having a proactive system, and that's what's, clients I have all the time, it's always, hey, what type of system do you have to establish the reliability? And how you go ahead the severity, how you classify that. And then it's, well, yeah, we do, but we can't move it because ultimately the cost. Well, if they have that aspect of being able to go ahead and quantify it into a dollar driven, speak CFO.
Yeah.
You can go ahead and do that. You can go ahead and create that system that is proactive, not reactive.
Yeah.
As far as quality management systems go, having multiple ones, the eyes of FDA, yes, have what you need to go ahead and what you need to establish your CGMP principles.
Yeah.
But as far as establishing 1345 or any other type of schemes you utilize, it's how do you integrate and how do you organize that? The organization and what gaps do you identify and how do you organize that all together is the ultimate premise of what I guess notified body wise would look at.
That's awesome, John. Thanks for sharing. And guys, we're going to leave it at that for now. I'm going to share with you. First of all, I'm going to give first thanks Steve again. Give him a chance to process his thoughts a little bit and share one or two key takeaways in just a moment with us. But I want to remind you a few housekeeping items. We meet every Friday, guys. So those of you who are new, put this on your calendar if you like this kind of conversation, 11 a.m. Eastern. If you miss one of these conversations, you can find a recording and some key highlights on my Let's Talk Risk newsletter. The link is now in the event page. You can go and sign up. And finally, I want to emphasize all of you have, without a doubt in my mind, key insights to share. And I love it when you come on board on stage and share that, just like these gentlemen have done today. If you want to be a participant, a guest in my conversation with you on these events, just raise your hand, reach out to me, and we'll talk and we'll plan a session with you. With that, guys, thanks again. And Steve, you have just a minute or so to wrap up with some key thoughts in your mind that we should take away.
I don't know if I've ever been able to talk just for a minute or so, but I will do my best. Okay. Naveen, the part of the conversation that I like the most is the what's in it for me piece of the conversation, which means for all of your listeners, I think that there is just a fantastic opportunity because you are all regulatory experts and professionals. You have the unique skill to spot and translate risk for others inside of your organizations in a way that will distinguish you as invaluable resources. Getting those kinds of insights, finding people who can keep their heads up and say, hey, there's not just a technical regulatory requirement that we need to satisfy, there are also organizational implications that we need to manage. That is gold. And so if your listeners are able to become more sensitive to those kinds of issues and to communicate to those issues, fantastic.
And you know what, Steve, I'll add to that. Probably ChatGPT will not be able to do that kind of work. Okay, so it's job security, guys. Okay, with that,
seriously.
We leave it at that. And I again appreciate all of you guys showing up, all of you participating so actively. This is what I love. Steve, thank you again. And
my
guys,
pleasure.
Everybody have a good weekend ahead. We'll connect once again next Friday. So please show up and we'll have another conversation. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.